I remember stepping off the transport plane into the sweltering heat of Louisiana in the summer of 2006. The air was thick with humidity, wrapping around me like a damp blanket, and the chorus of cicadas filled the evening sky. The base was vast, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Fresh out of training, I was both excited and anxious to begin my new assignment as an Air Force airman stationed here. That first night, after settling into my quarters, I joined a group of seasoned airmen around a modest fire pit behind the barracks. The flickering flames cast long shadows, and the scent of burning wood mingled with the earthy aroma of the surrounding forest. The conversation flowed easily, stories of past assignments, playful banter, and bits of advice for a newcomer like me. Eventually, the topic shifted to local legends and ghost stories tied to the base. One tale, in particular, caught my attention. The story of a little girl who had died at the storage complex during its construction. The way they spoke about her, hushed tones and furtive glances, sent a slight chill down my spine despite the warm night. Later, as the group began to disperse, an experienced airman named James pulled me aside. His expression was serious, eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. "Listen," he began. "There's more truth to that story than most care to admit." He went on to explain that the little girl had been playing on the construction site when a tragic accident claimed her life. Ever since, odd occurrences had been reported around the area known as Echo Street. Unexplained noises, shadows moving in the corner of one's eye, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. I nodded politely, though inwardly I remained skeptical. Ghost stories were a staple at every base, a way to initiate newcomers and pass long nights. I thanked him for the information and made my way back to my quarters, convinced that the legends were nothing more than tales spun to entertain. As I lay in bed, the sounds of the Louisiana night enveloped me. Distant animal calls, the rustling of leaves, and the persistent hum of insects. Sleep came slowly as my mind replayed the stories I'd heard. Despite my skepticism, there was something about the earnestness in James's voice that I couldn't shake. The idea of a haunting seemed absurd, yet a part of me was undeniably intrigued. I told myself it was just the novelty of a new place and the lingering adrenaline from a day of firsts. With a deep breath, I closed my eyes, unaware of how deeply entwined my fate would become with the legend of the little girl on Echo Street. 3 years had passed since that first night by the fire, and the tales of the little girl had slipped into the recesses of my memory. It was the spring of 2009 when I was assigned to a night patrol with Mason, a fellow airman known for his sharp humor and steady nerves. Our regular patrol vehicle was out of commission due to unexpected maintenance issues, so we were handed the keys to an old cattle truck. The vehicle was a relic, its engine loud, its frame rattling with every pothole we encountered. Mason chuckled as we climbed in, saying, "Well, this'll keep us awake if nothing else does." The night was unusually still as we began our rounds. The moon hung low, casting elongated shadows across the tarmac. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, our radio crackled with a request. We were to perform a final patrol of the storage complex. This area was a bit of an oddity on the base, a cluster of old warehouses and storage units that required physical checks because their security systems were outdated. It was also the place where, years ago, a little girl had allegedly met her tragic end. I hadn't thought about that story in ages, but as we headed toward the complex, it crept back into my mind. We approached the 2 large gates that marked the entrance to the storage complex. They groaned in protest as we pushed them open, the sound echoing into the quiet night. Driving onto Echo Street, the main road that cut through the complex, I felt a slight unease settle in my stomach. The warehouses loomed on either side like silent giants, their windows dark and vacant. The headlights of the cattle truck did little to pierce the darkness ahead, and the vehicle's constant rattling seemed to be the only sound in an otherwise silent world. As we navigated the narrow lanes between the storage units, Mason broke the silence. "You ever hear any of the stories about this place?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I glanced over, caught off guard by the question. "You mean the one about the little girl?" I replied. He nodded. "Yeah, that one. Supposedly she still wanders around here." I shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. "I heard it when I first got here, but I figured it was just something to spook the newbies." Mason didn't respond, and we continued down Echo Street, the air between us thick with unspoken thoughts. We stopped at each structure to check the locks, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The usual sounds of the night. Crickets, distant animal calls, the rustling of leaves were absent. It was as if the entire area was holding its breath. The silence was unsettling, amplifying the sound of our footsteps on the gravel. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though every time I turned around, there was nothing but shadows. As we climbed back into the truck after the last checkpoint, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. "Let's head back," I said, and Mason nodded in agreement. As we began our drive back along Echo Street, the atmosphere felt even heavier than before. The silence that enveloped us was unnatural, as if the entire world had been muted. The usual nocturnal sounds were absent. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, not even the drone of insects. The only sound was the constant rumble of the cattle truck's engine, which suddenly seemed inadequate against the pressing quiet. I glanced over at Mason, who was gripping the steering wheel a bit tighter than usual. "Do you feel that?" I asked softly. He nodded, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "It's too quiet," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Without warning, a low, haunting moan pierced the silence. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, ethereal and chilling, reminiscent of the unsettling noises from a horror movie I once saw called The Grudge. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Did you hear that?" I asked, hoping it was just my imagination. Mason's knuckles were white against the wheel. "Yeah," he said tersely. The moan came again, louder this time, seeming to echo from all directions. The rational part of my mind searched for an explanation. Maybe it was the wind, or an animal. But there was no wind, and no animal I knew of made a sound like that. Panic began to set in, as the moaning grew more intense, almost surrounding us. Mason slammed his foot on the accelerator, and the cattle truck lurched forward, its engine protesting with a loud groan. The gates that had seemed so solid earlier now felt like a barrier we desperately needed to cross. As we approached them, they appeared to open on their own, though in hindsight, it was probably just the momentum of the truck pushing them aside. We didn't stop to question it. Once we were back on the main road leading to the base, the oppressive silence lifted, and the familiar sounds of the night returned. We drove straight to the security office, neither of us speaking a word until we were safely inside. We found our flight chief reviewing some paperwork at his desk. He looked up, surprised to see us back so soon. "Everything all right?" he asked. Mason and I exchanged a glance before I stepped forward to explain what had happened. As I recounted the events, the silence, the moaning sounds, our shared fear, I half expected him to dismiss our story. Instead, he listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You're not the first to experience something like this out there," he said quietly. He then shared his own encounters, mentioning sightings of a man in a top hat walking along a narrow dirt road near the storage complex, and stories of a madman who was hit by a patrol car but vanished into the woods without a trace. His admission was both unsettling and oddly comforting. It meant we weren't imagining things, but it also confirmed that something unexplained was happening on Echo Street. From that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the legends held more truth than I'd ever considered. I made a point to avoid that area during night patrols whenever possible. The base continued its routine operations, but for me, the shadows held new shapes, and the silence was no longer merely the absence of sound. It was a reminder of an experience that defied explanation, one that left an indelible mark on my time at the base. In the weeks that followed our harrowing experience on Echo Street, the atmosphere on the base shifted subtly for me. The routines of military life continued as always: morning drills, equipment checks, training exercises, but beneath the surface a current of unease flowed through my days. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, attuned to the slightest, unfamiliar sound. Mason and I spoke little of that night, an unspoken agreement to keep the details between us. Yet, the memory lingered, as vivid as if it had just happened. Curiosity, however, began to gnaw at me. I wanted to understand what we had encountered, to find some rational explanation that could ease my mind. I started spending my free time researching the history of the base and the surrounding area. In the dusty archives of the base library, I found old newspaper clippings and construction records. One article from the local paper dated back to the early 1980s, detailing a tragic accident at the storage complex construction site. A young girl had indeed lost her life there. The piece mentioned her name was Emily, and she was the daughter of a construction worker. Reading her story, I felt a pang of sadness mixed with a chilling connection. Emboldened by this discovery, I approached the experienced airman who had first told me about the little girl when I arrived at the base. James was surprised but receptive, and we sat down over cups of coffee in the mess hall. I shared our encounter on Echo Street, and he listened without interruption. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "You're not alone," he said. He went on to reveal that over the years, several airmen had reported similar experiences, not just of the little girl, but also sightings of the man in a top hat and the elusive madman who vanished into the woods. Some believed these were separate entities. Others thought they were manifestations of something larger, a kind of residual energy from the land's troubled past. These conversations led me to realize that the base held many secrets, stories whispered in the barracks, but rarely acknowledged openly. The blending of our routine duties with these unexplained occurrences created a unique tension, one that challenged my previously held beliefs about the world. I began to accept that some things defy explanation, existing in the spaces between what we can see and what we can understand. While I remained diligent in my responsibilities, I carried this new perspective with me, a silent acknowledgement of the mysteries that surrounded us. From that point on, I approached my patrols with a heightened sense of awareness, but also a newfound respect for the stories that form the fabric of a place. I still avoided Echo Street at night whenever possible, but I no longer dismissed the legends as mere fiction. They were part of the reality of life on the base, threads woven into our daily existence. My experience had shown me that sometimes the line between the ordinary and the inexplicable is thinner than we might like to admit.